I'm Sophie.
And we work at ANROS, Australia's national research organisation for women's safety. Our goal is to help decision makers across policy, practice and everyday life to make decisions that are informed by evidence.
Together, we've been writing a synthesis of ANROS's research about children and young people's experiences of domestic and family violence in Australia.
We decided to write this synthesis because everyone agrees that children and young people deserve to be safe from domestic and family violence. But this often doesn't translate into real-world action.
Yeah, at ANROS we had over 20 reports all about children and young people's experiences of domestic and family violence, and each of those reports made numerous recommendations. We just didn't want these recommendations for action just gathering dust.
So we wanted to make these recommendations and actions accessible and ensure that people know what the evidence says. We know that people working with children and young people and their families often know what the problems are, but are less confident about how to actually address them.
So one of the key recommendations coming from this research was that we need to centre the strengths, needs and voices of children and young people. This recommendation is informed by the evidence that shows that children and young people are profoundly impacted by domestic and family violence, even though the adults in their lives may not be aware of this or recognise this themselves.
And children and young people's experiences and needs are also unique. They change and develop as children and young people grow and develop, and they can also persist long after the violence has ended.
What the research tells us is that children and young people need responses that recognise and treat them as unique victims, not as secondary victims or worse, not impacted by domestic and family violence at all.
These responses require more collaboration, more child-focused responses, and more knowledge and skill development for practitioners who are working with children and young people and their families. And at the heart of this work needs to be the voices of children and young people themselves. We cannot do this work without them.
Children and young people are experts in their own experience. If we want to develop these genuinely useful and tailored responses, then we need to hear from them. And the thing is that they really want to be heard.
The children and young people that we spoke to while we were developing this work told us that they want to be meaningfully involved. They have lived expertise that they can share, they have ideas, and they told us that they need to be involved from the start. Children and young people have unique ideas, unique insights, and they're asking to be heard.
My name is Maddie. I am at the end of my psychology degree and I do everything public health with health promotion. I do a lot of work in the primary prevention space as well as education. I wanted to participate today because I believe that young people involved in the conversation is the way of the future. I believe that if we're going to be creating these educational initiatives, these strategies, and actually getting them involved, we cannot make decisions unless we actually fundamentally understand young people. And I think that through these opportunities and through these conversations is that we can actually start to move forward and really see that light.
My name is Rachel Pascual Weatherall. I am a proud Māori Filipino young woman who grew up in Queensland leading some place-based work in gender-based violence. I'm a lifelong former practitioner and now a public servant who's worked in this space. And I also have lived experience as a child with domestic and family violence.
My name is Ria Wire. I am a Torres Strait Islander and an Indian social work student, currently living in Meanjin, Brisbane. I wanted to participate in this panel because I think it's important that there's a young Indigenous voice speaking about issues that are relevant to them. And I think someone should be here on this panel to represent those who can't be here.
My name's Evie Clayton. I am a domestic and family violence specialist and advocate in this space. I'm also an ambassador for National Survivors Day. I joined this sector due to my lived experience of domestic and family violence as a child through adolescence and adulthood, and also my journey through sexual assault. And the reason I wanted to come today is due to the importance of acknowledging children as victims in their own right. I believe that a lot of the time people view children as collateral damage in domestic and family violence, and I think it's time to start acknowledging them as primary victims because it is their right.
My name's Kirsty Williamson. I'm a Senior Project Officer for WorkUP Queensland. I'm also a victim survivor of child sexual assault. I wanted to participate today to use my voice as a survivor and a young person to share my experience and my learnings from working in this sector and to provide some insight on how to best engage with young people.
My name's Mac. I work for YFS in a program called R for Respect, and that's working with young people and talking with them about healthy relationships, consent, red flags and green flags. And I wanted to come in and give a perspective about the work that I do and what we're hearing from young people in this space.
My name's Harrison James. I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. I'm an activist. I run a campaign called Your Reference Ain't Relevant, and essentially we're pushing government all over the country to reform the provision of good character references for convicted child sex offenders. So right now they're going through court being found guilty, and then in sentencing they're allowed to have these letters, and we're pushing government to abolish that provision. Why I wanted to participate today was because I think that speaking about these stories is not just an individual thing that I want to pursue. I think it's a collective responsibility, and I think when we come together, when we unite and we share these stories, we heal collectively as a community, and we learn from each other's nuances and difference, and that's a beautiful thing that should be embraced, and I wanted to contribute to that.
I think organisations have a responsibility to hold safe spaces for young people. There is a risk, if you're asking young people to be a part of something, but not creating a space where they can be themselves or have space to unwind, that can not be beneficial.
I think traditionally advocacy has been for children and young people has been about them and not with them. And I think organisations have a profound responsibility to engage with them and meet, not just allow them to be passive recipients of information, but to work with them in partnership, which is a constant theme that we keep bringing up today. It's really important. But I also think organisations with such stature in the space, and it can be daunting for a young person, that we really need to ask ourselves the tough questions like, are we listening? Are we willing to actually take the information that young people give us and take that on board, not just with, using our ears and listen, but in genuine action? And I think that's a profound responsibility. It's incredibly tough for organisations that are, whether it's they're getting funding or whatever, to take that on board. But it's critical that we have that sort of open mind and have that capability to take that information on board and actually do something with it.
And I think to follow on from that as well, is I think that what I've seen anyways is that there are all these assumptions being made about young people. There's assumptions being made from people that have grown up in a completely different generation. They've had completely different socialized experiences. They've grown up in a completely different economic environment. And a lot of the time they haven't experienced what those young people have experienced. So I think it's valuing lived experience. It's being able to bring young people to the table to actually understand what is it that they really need that support with, and then exactly like what was said is creating a safe space to work with them, alongside them, so then they're actually part of that.
But are we actually willing to amplify their voices, or are we here to sanitize and make their narrative more palatable? I think we actually have to be willing to uplift these voices, and it's hard because young people have a lot to say about organisations, and sometimes it's not the best thing that organisations want to hear. But it's important that we take that information on board and are practical with it and put it into practice. Yeah, rather than just writing them off as someone who's just here to have a go and prove their name.
So let's look at this through like a historical context. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, there's been no trust in services because for so often these systems are used to oppress us, and
the best thing that, like, if a person is coming forward and disclosing about violence in their life, is asking how these support services first are giving them trust to be able to talk about this. And I think it also requires support services and organisations to critically question themselves and question their position within this, their privilege, and these things need to be questioned, like these support systems, they need to be questioned on a grassroots level, on an individual and on a macro level as well. Like, if people are listening to stories of violence and harm, how do they sit in this story? Because that's also important, because you're who we're going to for support. You're who we're going to for help. So what is your position within this story? Because it's so valid, all of it. Every part, every character in this story is valid, so...
Was wanting to just add on to something Harry was saying in relation to children speaking or young people speaking up. And we're not trained, I suppose. I personally didn't get any training in this, and maybe definitely I've said some things that are off tap and probably not taken in the best context. And it's understanding that young people are going to come into this space with that lived experience, and sometimes talking within their trauma, not outside of their trauma at the beginning of this journey, because that's not something that is an innate ability for most people to do. And what they have to say is so important. So when they're being listened to, it needs to be considered that they are just young people as well, and they don't know exactly how to articulate everything that they're saying in the most professional capacity, because it is lived experience, not a professional experience. And I think it's really important for organisations from top down, so even the small organisations in regional, rural parts of Queensland, to constantly have consultation with other people externally from that organisation, because what we see is a lot of people, staying in an organisation for 15, 20 years, and they don't do any continued professional development, or if they do, it's a box ticking exercise and not genuine, continual professional development. And I think sometimes we need to look at what does professional development look like as well. Can that look like this experience where we're all talking together and having this really robust conversation and engaging young people in those opportunities as well? Because I can go to every different webinar and seminar I want to, where there's people with power who are telling me information, but if we're not having the people with the lived experience holding the mic, then we're not going to get much further in being able to support these young people.
And just to follow on from that, in terms of trauma, like trauma-informed is like this big buzzword that goes around now, and it sounds exciting and like we're doing the work. But do you actually understand how trauma operates in people? Because sometimes, like, we're just survivors who are here to tell their stories, and there's a sense of urgency to get something done. And sometimes that comes out in messy ways because we're so fraught with just trying to figure out what the hell happened to us. And that understanding and that empathy needs to be there at the forefront of all our work, whether it's government or organisation, whatever the hell it is. And understanding that there's a distinct power imbalance throughout all this, like a survivor speaking out, getting on their 2 feet and overcoming their trauma. That's huge. And it's not always going to come out in the most media, clean way where it's like a cool, what do they call it? Like, what's the messaging when you get it on the media? It's like a buzzword or something. Anyway, it's like a soundbite. That's what it is. Yeah. Thank you. You got me. It's not going to come out in like this cool little soundbite that's going to be aired on the Today Show at 9:40 a.m. It's messy what we've been through, and it's not fun to speak about, and it's not going to come out in that clean, distinct way that's sanitized as well. This is fraught with trauma. We've been through hell. It's going to come out, and it's going to actually. And I think what that is, it's not specifically an attack on the individuals that we're speaking of, or the organizations, or whether they're people in government that we're speaking about, but it's an attack on the lack of accountability. It's not a personal, it's the lack of accountability. because that's what we have right now is an accountability problem.
I just really want to follow up from that point, also bring back to what Ria was talking about before, is I think that we're seeing that there's this top to bottom approach, and people that are in this power, that are these key stakeholders, they're making decisions, they haven't ever put themselves in a room that they have unpacked their biases. They haven't sat down and said, actually, let me unpack my privilege. Let me think about it, because I think that what I've seen anyways is that you've got these people up here that are making the decisions for people down here, and they, and then even just bringing back on to the media about how these biases and these beliefs and attitudes then reflect back in how media, continues this narrative about, the buzzword about trauma informed, but then you see that there's certain, messages that's been put out in the media that just continue to victim blame young people, and how that then is all correlated to that individual who is seeking support, and how they might sit back and think, if I speak up or if I say something, they're not going to believe me. They're going to victim blame me. And how that there's so many levels that impact what actually that individual person is going through.
Yeah, just going off the conversation, I think organisations need to question, how are they decolonising practice? How are they working to be anti-racist? How are they working at flattening power structures? Because if people aren't asking those questions, how can even change happen?
It's all about empathy and decision making, which we tend to forget. Go sit in a room with these people. Go sit in a room with survivors or First Nation communities. Go sit there and have that conversation. It's going to be tough. You're going to be questioned. You're going to be told you've done the wrong thing, and that's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But as one of the best in this space, Grace Tame, says, conversations about these things are uncomfortable, but nothing is more uncomfortable than going through it. So you have to sit there and listen to this so we can get it right for the next person, because that's what everyone at these couches right now want to do, is use their stories or use their experience in the field to ensure that not even a tenth of what happened to us happens to the next person. And that's all we're here to do. We're not here to fight. We're here to collaborate and unite and get the job done, because we don't want this happening to anyone else.
Yeah. And I think on top of that as well, as you were saying, where do we value our knowledge? If we're only valuing knowledge in papers and research, we're missing a whole bunch of stories from word, right? About people's life and about people's experience. And that's dangerous if we're only valuing what is written down on paper.
I think for the organisation's responsibility, yes, trauma-informed is a buzzword. It does get thrown around, and there is good practice out there. But when you're listening to, say, if it's mum coming into the service and talking about her experience and the way that she might act because she has experienced trauma, the way that a young person is going to act when they've experienced trauma is going to be completely different. And I think that's where some parts are missing, and people think that young people are acting out and not attending school, but there is trauma there, and it's a completely different way that they're experiencing it compared to a woman in her 30s or in her 40s that has experienced trauma. So I think there's a key understanding there that needs to be met.
To just kind of tie everyone's points together, I feel like the individuals, the ones that are doing the support services, the ones that are in the decision making, it's really important that there is some type of space that they can actually sit back and reflect on not only their own biases or their own beliefs, but being able to create that opportunity for them to be gently encouraged and nudged to actually create that intrinsic motivation that they want to learn, they want to be a part of it, because shame is not an effective motivator. And if we're thinking about the historical perspective of the individuals that are in this, these key policy decision-making positions, if they feel like if like we think about it, we need to be able to think, okay, well, it's those people that we need to have everyone in the room and ensuring that every single person that is involved in this area of work, they've unpacked their biases and they understand that if they do hold any type of racist beliefs, homophobic beliefs, transphobic beliefs, ensuring that they can unpack that and then really take that next step forward, because there's nothing worse than people talking about it. And like what we see diversity and inclusion, workplace programs, and hire us to do this, and it's just another box ticking process. But we really need to ensure that people are actually doing the work and they want to be a part of the change, and it's not just another, yep, okay, cool, here's inclusivity.
And I think that's a whole organisation approach as well. I think some orgs can let that drive slip, and it's up to one person or it's up to one team to run that. I think it's everyone's responsibility.
For me, I come from a space where I work in this sector from my lived experience, and I don't hold that piece of paper, so that with a bachelor degree. So there is a lot of power imbalance for me. I don't have the professional education that a lot of other people do have that is really valuable, and I have to continually advocate for myself on my own knowledge and expertise, because we all, as people who have experienced life in general and a lot of different traumas and had lots of different experiences, we come with a lot of knowledge that you can't get from a degree, or you can't get it from a development from someone who has a degree who's telling you what to do. And I think it's there's a huge power imbalance, and I think we're starting to see the shift, but we really need to start listening to the people with the lived experience more and acknowledging how precious that knowledge is. But if someone is willing to share that with you, you need to start to listen. I think that's a huge power imbalance that we have currently.
I think that's a really good point. And I think that when we're thinking about these discussions, I know that the work that I've been in, whenever I have been speaking about gender-based violence, or I have been speaking about ways that men can show up or support in these spaces, I've found that even being the only woman in the room is sometimes dismissed. It's like, well, you don't understand this, and you don't understand this. And although it's one of those things where I'm kind of like, and this is part of the problem, is that even though I'm speaking as a woman for women experiencing domestic violence or gender-based violence, I'm still being told that what I'm trying to put forward, it still is criticized so much. And I feel that difference compared to when I'm in a room that has more of that gender diversity.
I think also being a survivor, like, you have that experience of being on the worst end of that power imbalance, and that's something that you have to carry with you for the rest of your life, and you constantly have to check yourself on that. So it's important for organizations to understand that, whether you disclose your experience or not, but even as a young person, that to not be spoken down to feel comfortable and feel safe in your workplace, that people want your knowledge as a young person, as a survivor, as someone with experience in any sort of industry. Like, you've come from a communications background, like you also have that experience as well. I've come from a project planning background, like I've got that experience. So it's important for people to understand that as well, and create a safe space where particularly survivors don't feel like they're always at that lower end of that power imbalance.
Yeah, I totally agree, Kirsty. And I think too, there's power in just your presence. And I think we as young people do so much challenging already every day in our day-to-day lives, and then professionally in our roles, whether that's direct delivery to young people, in a service provider, in an advocacy role, we're already doing that work. So again, just being present in itself is challenging power, particularly when you're a survivor or you're from a minority background. And just holding that space so that other young people can see themselves and see an avenue and an alternative, and not necessarily take the journey you're on, because none of our journeys are the same, but actually take something from your story and see the potential and, in their own story telling, if that's something they wish to pursue. But absolutely professionally, like, I've had comments in my experience of, are you the intern or are you on placement? And I'm like, no, I'm a senior policy officer. Like, this is my job and I'm experienced enough to hold this job. And that's that confidence in the way we operate as a young person in these spaces is really important, and something we, myself included, have to remind ourselves of, is actually, no, we're capable, we're competent, and we can do this job well because of our lived experience, our professional experience.
Yeah. I think a massive power imbalance that I often feel is being a native on this country and having to navigate the systems as a native person. Like coming out of DV as well, it's especially for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, it's so hush-hush. Everything is hush-hush, and through intergenerational trauma and shame, it is often liked to be kept that way. If you don't want to be, isolated from your clan or your country, a lot of the time, the expectation is that you just deal with it. You just deal with violence, and it's just what comes through every generation. And if you choose to break that cycle, which means you also challenge the elders above you, the ancestors, the people that have done it differently, it means as a young person, you have to be able to break that law of theirs. And then what am I left with? I'm left with the colony. I'm left with what I can do in a white man's world. So it's really, really difficult, because being a native plays so much of a role in the way that I will experience assistance about this, because I'm choosing to be open about an issue that is so often hushed about, and I have to, I think, be able to accept where I fit in this line, in this position, to be able to truthfully help myself. I have to be able to say, okay, I'm less in this area, I have less than this, but I can go somewhere, or I can speak to people where I can get more. That's what you have to look at to be able to tackle these power imbalances. You have to look at the pros and the cons, and you have to look that, yeah, you may be a little less on one side for something, but I'm so much more for getting help, though. I'm so much more.
I think you've raised such a good point, and I think that a lot of victim survivors get to this point where they have experienced gender-based violence, they've experienced a horrible event, and it gets to the point where speaking to someone, reaching out to someone, even reporting it and seeking help, and it's, well, if I speak to people, if I tell someone what happened, am I going to lose my support network? Because it's one of those things where where they're experiencing that victim blaming, there is so much research that if one victim of sexual assault, gender-based violence, domestic violence, if they are able to seek social support, then their well-being, it makes such a difference to their overall well-being and their health for the long term. And you've just raised a really good point of just being able to say, hey, like, it's really important that when people are making that decision, it's not a weakness to seek help.
No.
As a survivor of child sexual abuse and an activist, like, my work is heavily influenced by redistributing power and challenging those norms, because I know what it's like, as you were saying, Kirsty, to be on the receiving end of some of the worst power imbalances imaginable. But also, two things can be true at once. I'm also a co-founder of a national campaign, and we bring on survivors to come be spokespeople. And I hold a position of power. So it actually requires me to be constantly reflective and to understand how I might inadvertently be perpetuating those power dynamics that I seek to dismantle. So for me, it's constantly about putting myself, like constantly working through that and asking those questions and not being critical of myself, but holding myself accountable and ensuring that I do what's best for the people that come on board and share their stories, because that's what I wanted to start out doing. It was really important to me. So yeah, I think recognizing that and having that ability to take yourself outside of your own sort of own self, and recognizing where you might be contributing to that power dynamic as well.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting on some of the work that we do at Art for Respect. And one thing we bring up a lot is the difference between care versus control. So looking at that in relationships, but I'm also wondering if that can also be applied to some of these power dynamics and power structures. Like, where are people's intentions in this? Are they using it to get a certain outcome within the organization, or are they using it because they're for the people? And just thinking about that difference. On a practical level, we do an activity called the line. So we ask young people a question, and depending on what they think or believe, they'll say, stand in a certain spot, that's the okay spot, or on another side, that's like the not okay spot. And one of the questions is it okay if I want to know where my partner is all the time? And we'll get a very mixed reaction. And I guess our team, it's very important that regardless of what the young people's answers are, that we listen in a non-judgmental way. And even when we give our own perspective, we're not talking down on the young people, making sure that they still feel heard and valued, regardless of if that's their belief and if their belief is different to ours. So giving them that space to reflect and think about themselves and also what we've talked about.
And power imbalances can manifest in spaces that are meant to support survivors, whether it's the legal system. I don't call it a justice system because there's no justice there. But whether it's the legal system or the healthcare system or social services, there's a disconnect between those who wield decision-making power and those who are directly impacted by those decisions. So I think that's important to recognize and understand that that's a very real reality. And to ignore it would be ignorant.
And I think to just follow on from that as well, that with these different divisions, so the legal system, the healthcare system, understanding that when it comes to victim survivors seeking support, that these power imbalances, it's like this little ecosystem. It will show up in different ways. And for someone who has just experienced a traumatic event, they're just trying to navigate, just trying to just feel supported. They just really want to be able to get to that end without having to deal with every other single systematic bias or power imbalance. And it's really ensuring that individuals in these different divisions in this space understand that power imbalances can show up from just meetings and the ways that you're speaking about things or concerns, and that can be through even just a condescending tone, but also in how, again, the legal system works and what occurs from that. And I think anyone in this space needs to understand these power imbalances may show up in different ways and they present in different ways and impact people.
And everyone's work here is so important because it's bridging that gap.
Yeah. That just makes me think, like, language is so powerful. And sometimes we don't realize the language that we use, how it can either uplift someone or bring someone down. And how, actually acknowledging the words that we use and how we speak and how that can impact someone else.
And exactly like what you just said, that's something called sociolinguistics, and understanding how our social attitudes can actually come through our language. And I think, again, being able to reflect on how we're presenting, how we're showing up, how we're having these conversations. And if we do say something that it may come across in a certain way, being able to have that accountability to unpack and say, oh, I understand that maybe my own bias or a belief has come out, and being able to take accountability for that.
And who has the best language in order to inform that lived experience? Survivor-led solutions are the way to go. And it's the only way to go, in my opinion, to listen to that and let that inform that practice. And having that lived experience inform that rather than some theoretical framework.
So to begin with, where are young people hanging out? Young people are hanging out online. I think we've seen this really big increase after COVID. Young people are socializing online. They are finding information online. They are looking for support online. And when we're thinking about how we want to reach young people, being able to give some type of option that is available online for them to either, if maybe it's a community engagement, so that, hey, have your say in this. If you've experienced this, what can help you? Even from the support side. So Kids Helpline, I think, has done this really well, that they have a messaging platform if they want to seek support, and being able to ensure that the people that are supporting young people understand that technology is a part of young people. I know personally, I feel technology is a part of me. If I walk outside and I don't have my phone on me, I feel like I'm missing a part of myself. And it's infiltrated with everything that I do. It's how I connect with people. It's how I do my work. It's how I speak to people, how I connect with individuals, and ensuring that anyone in the support services understand that issues and challenges and even events can occur online in these technology spaces. And it's very different compared to 10, 20 years ago. It's actually understanding that individuals providing support understand the role that technology has on young people, so that, hey, if one young person has experienced sexploitation, there's nothing worse than speaking to someone that's seeking support and they're like, oh, like, just turn your phone off, technology, you're hanging out, just turn your phone off, you're hanging out on technology too much. Understanding that it plays a very different role compared to what it was like in the early 2000s.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, because we're living in a time where young people are seeing 24/7 or having 24/7 access to what's going on around the world. And the impact that can have on a young person's mental well-being can be really, really detrimental. So when we think about, core beliefs of young people as well, whether that's, like the manscape, or where certain spots are popping up on social media about toxic masculinity, like those are very accessible. And yeah, it's constant.
100%. I think it's acknowledging as well that being a young person today is really tough. And I think we need to understand young people. We need to go beyond the physical and the digital sort of lens. They're in these two camps. But we need to meet young people. We need to think, where are young people at? Where are they at emotionally? Where are they at intellectually? Where are they at socially? Like as Mac was touching on, we're living in a very complex world where there's an abundance of information, where we have more access to platforms where we're able to voice our opinions, yet we feel like we're not being heard by people in positions of power. We have resources that can connect us, yet there's an epidemic of loneliness. We're in a very complex time it's hard to pin it. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about before. We have to meet young people where they're at as individuals, rather than just having this monolithic lens. That's how it is. This is the bog standard way of how we're going to do this. And you have to try fit into that box, because it's not realistic if we go with that approach at all.
And I think in a physical sense, young people are in school, like YFS are going into schools and engaging with young people there. And young people that are witnessing domestic and family violence at home, experiencing domestic and family violence at home, maybe their safe space is at a youth service. So it's really important for the organisations in the domestic and family violence sector to connect in with youth services. I'm sure if you walked into a youth service compared to a domestic and family violence counselling service, they're going to look completely different. There's going to be activities there for young people to, do something with their hands while they're talking with someone, or take their mind off something, or just try and calm down or relax. Maybe there's food there, water. So I think it's important for services in our sector to connect in with those youth services and see the way that they engage with young people that gets young people to talk about things. And maybe they can take some of those learnings and support young people that may be coming in with mum when she's going for her session at the domestic and family violence.
Absolutely.
Centre.
And I think as well, being able to create that space that young people have that want to engage with those services, because I know that even when I was in high school, it was very much like, oh no, we don't do that. We'll go out and do something else instead. And I think in showing that the people that are in the community and the youth services have engaging activities that are relevant to young people and actually are creating that safe space, so that it's not like, oh, I don't want to go over there. They're engaging to be able to then have that pathway to then also get that support as well.
Something to add to that. It's really, really great points, but also it just illustrates that young people are in spaces that value authenticity. We don't want superficiality. Like, we can't put up with the bullshit, excuse the language. We can't put up with that, like, we don't want that. We do gravitate towards spaces that push for diversity and inclusivity, and we want that. We don't want this superficial way of doing things anymore. We engage in conversations that challenge the status quo, that push for justice and equity and change. Like, we're doing that. It's important to embrace that. Like, that's a good thing.
I think there's if we want to look and try find where young people are, I think the first word that comes to my head is community. And so just getting in touch with community is like what you really want your approach to be when you're wanting to engage with young people. Because we're navigating all these worlds, like this world now is just so much more mental health aware. So then we're on that journey. And then, topics like trauma will come up, and we will question our own relationships, and DV and violence, and even climate change. Like, these are trending things that are happening in a young person on this country and in their life. So I just feel like if you want to engage with young people, know about what type of world they're living in for like right now, as well as what type of world and how they might have to navigate it with what sort of support systems are out there. So like, I don't know, I just think that like to do this you have to be quite flexible and really adaptable, and we are wanting, like Harrison's correct, we are wanting more diversity and inclusion at the same space. We want more of a cultural lens. I think we're just asking so many questions about ourselves, and rightfully so. We're on this journey of self-discovery, but for the people that are searching to come and engage with us, have this community approach as well.
Young people will show up when you are genuine about wanting to connect, and Harry captured it perfectly before, when you take the time to sit down with them on their level and have the conversation and understand their journey and where they're coming from. And like, I've been in the policy DV space for a few years now, but before that, a practitioner with young people for a long time. And it's about taking away that clinicalness of the work, because young people don't want to walk into 4 white walls and someone with a lanyard. That's not how they're going to connect. So it's actually stripping back that institutionalized approach to the work and actually being a human first and wanting to connect as a human first, not because this is what I get paid to do 9 to 5 every day. And that's something I've always held in my work with young people, and I believe why they've been so open and so genuine about their experiences and why. I think it speaks to the success of the program. So.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to the physical aspect of where are children, where are these young people. I think something I see particularly a lot at home in Townsville is there are a lot of children in resi care, or a lot of children who aren't attending school because we miss a lot of the time the most vulnerable kids when we're having these conversations, because if you're experiencing domestic and family violence at home and then you're not going to school, and if you don't go to school for a long period of time, you then have to work with the education department to go back to school and potentially not be allowed back at school because your behaviours from that trauma, you weren't acting in the way that the school wanted you to, so now you can't come back. So then education is impacted, those kids aren't at school. So where do they then go to find an outlet and resources? And they don't, a lot of children don't understand where to go if they don't have supportive people in their corner. So then how do we find these children as well when they're not linked in with the typical supports that would, school and access to a phone and have parents that can be supportive of this process? And I've recently had a really good outcome with a 15-year-old girl that I've been engaged with since she was 12. And the process, I've watched her go from being in school, really wanting to do well, and a lot of trauma has happened in the last 3 years, and it has taken 3 years of working with her for her to be open to engaging in support. And we're now at a stage where she has been able to engage with supports, but that was through a very roundabout way and just because I happened to be around at the right time. And the education department, I think, also really need to play a huge role in the way that they work with young people who are trying to reintegrate back into school, because there's no supports there for them. They are coming in from a government perspective and structure with no idea or understanding of how young people work. And I think we need to take the time to bring more supportive people with lived experience back into the space to support those young people, and going to the most vulnerable people, if that's in the resi care homes as well, because no one goes in there except some really young people work in resi care as well, and the lack of experience sometimes can play more harm on those children in those facilities if you don't have the knowledge to support them.
Yeah. I think as well, just kind of touching on what Rachel was saying, I think within this role is that young people's hearts need to be in the right place. So if people are going into this space and expecting, to be paid for it, going in and just working for the money, you lose the heart. Your heart needs to be there for the young people to create connection, build a rapport. And if people don't have that, like I know some of the relationship education is being run out in schools, and I know teachers are trying to run it, but if their heart is just trying to get it out because it's in the curriculum rather than because they care and think that that's important for young people to have, the message is going to be lost.
And if we want to engage with young people, to go off that, we have to recognize their power and agency. That's so important. Like, we have to trust them to innovate. We have to trust them to lead. We have to trust them to make decisions. When I started my campaign, which is trying to remove the provision of good character references for convicted child sex offenders, lawyers and people in positions of power, politicians, they'd say that's never going to happen. Who do you think you are? And I had to knock on 50 doors until I happened to knock on the 51st and they opened it and I was allowed to go in and speak about it. So that taught me two things: that persistence and determination in the current climate is key, but also that young people aren't taken seriously when they have actually valid and genuinely good idea. And that's got to change. That's got to be part of where our mindset shifts. We have to trust young people with that agency and that power that they possess. We can build movements that legitimately, that fulfill our vision from the out. We can do that. We have the power to do that. There's people that have proved that in this space, and a lot of you are sitting here right now.
I think shame can shut young people down. So if we bring people into a place of shame, young people don't feel comfortable expressing what's going on for them, what their beliefs are, how they're thinking and feeling. But empowerment is different. Empowerment can bring young people out of their shells and help them to reflect on themselves in a safe space, and then create changes that are going to benefit them and the people around them.
Yeah, I know firsthand as a survivor of child sexual abuse that shame acts as a barrier, and it prevents open discussions, and it isn't just shame isn't necessarily just an individual thing that we feel, it's a collective one. It's something that's sort of codified in our systems and institutions, and I think when that is perpetuated and that sort of culture of silence and secrecy is like the norm, or even not as overarching as that, just in sort of one-on-one interactions where an adult or person in a position of power is apprehensive to engage with this conversation, that sets the tone. Oh, this is something not to be spoken about. And that shame, that's a insurmountable wall that people with lived experience have to overcome. And it's very difficult. But it's really something that, as I said, is codified in these systems, and something that we have to dismantle and really be reflective on as well, and understand how we might be perpetuating that shame.
And I think as well, like what I said previously, shame isn't an effective motivator. You can't shame people, especially young people, to get involved in conversations if they've already felt like what they're experiencing is something wrong. Or, and even like what just Harry said was that if they feel like there is a tone that's been set that's like, well, we don't want to talk about this, like don't bring up this conversation, and then making them feel horrible or feel ashamed that they have experienced this in the first place, or they are experiencing this betrayal throughout a traumatic experience, then they aren't going to be seeking help because they've already been invalidated. And it's really important that anyone that is working in these organizations, anyone that is working in this space, needs to understand how shame presents in our language, in our behavior, as well as our nonverbal cues. How are we actually presenting? Because it can just be a simple look, it can be a simple tone of voice that can really make a difference.
I completely agree. And I just think that, like, while we go on this journey, it's important to tackle shame now and early in your life before it being something that grows and festers. And when you become older, it becomes harder for you to really acknowledge shame and then dismantle it. I think that's something that, like, I'm dealing with in my personal life with my elders, is this challenging of shame where it's almost like for them it's too late to, but it's just easier to breathe if you tackle it early on in your life, I feel.
And that's a really great point that you brought up, is that if a young person is experiencing shame from a parent, from someone that is their senior, then how does that trickle on to not only how they experience themselves and their own feelings, but what if a person comes to them, a friend comes to them, and they speak about their experience, but then they then bring that shame back out, and then how it can then impact that peer-to-peer support as well.
And I think it's also important to consider that when you're working with people who are choosing to use violence as well, it's important to have conversations with them, particularly young men, without eliciting shame onto them. They might have had something happen to them, and that's not their fault, but it is their responsibility, and it's everyone's responsibility to be respectful towards one another. So I think that's something that needs to be really embedded into the conversations, particularly with young men.
I think young people are incredibly perceptive as well. Like, we can tell when conversations are uncomfortable, or when adults are sort of tiptoeing around the actual subject matter. And I think our role as advocates in this space, or people in this space, working in this space, is to dismantle those barriers and really lead with the mindset that no discussion is too taboo or too difficult to engage in discussion with.
I think also acknowledging that there's would be a level of most people have a level of shame, most survivors, before having a conversation with anyone due to the victim blaming that they see or not understanding what's happened to them is wrong and it feels wrong, but they feel like they can't talk about it, so that shame is already there. And then if someone is, and then even accidentally adding more shame to the conversation, they are already not engaging that because of that initial shame. So I think it's about how do we engage young people to feel safe and comfortable to open up and speak about it before anyone gets the opportunity to add more shame.
That's a really great point. And to follow on from that as well, I think especially when we look at women, there's been a lot of this victim blaming shame that has been infiltrated and just kind of in our minds. Specifically, like I remember, it's always, well, don't walk down a dark alleyway by yourself. You make sure you're always sticking with your friends and really kind of putting that onus on the individual, especially women, to say, well, you're responsible if something bad happens to you. And when we're looking at victim blaming, we have behavioral victim blaming and we also have characterological victim blaming. So behavioral victim blaming is actually looking at the behaviors and the choices that you make. So that type of victim blaming would be, oh, well, she was walking down a dark alleyway, so she should have known better than doing that. And then, oh, well, she stayed with him, so what can she expect? And then how that, then going into more of the character side, is looking at personality characteristics. So, oh, she was flirty or she was having a good time, she wanted it. And understanding how then that then infiltrates into young people, because I know when I was growing up, it's very much, well, you should know better. Like, don't walk down a dark alleyway, and how it's really, you put so much responsibility on yourself that it's kind of like, well, it's your fault in the first place, so you should have known better. And how that victim blaming creates that shame. And then because you feel like it's your fault, it's kind of like, well, I should have known better. And then how that impacts that moving forward as well. So
I think a lot of also with shame can come from when we talk about the dark alleyways and we're like walking down the street late at night, that a lot of the time that's not where the violence is happening, it's happening at home. So being able to speak safely about what's happening at home, as well, the shame that this is your family and you're having to be very open to someone to say, I need help, because you're having to come to terms that your family system has broken down because there is a violent person and you're needing help and the children are needing help, and you have to find it within yourself to be able to accept that first, because you go into societal structures, say you grow up, you get married, you have kids, and that's your life and you have a happy little family, and when that picture is broken, you're going to feel shame anyways. And I think a lot of people still talk about the dark alleyways and aren't acknowledging that the violence is happening at home more than it's happening outside in the dark alleyway.
And I think it also goes back to the power imbalance that young people feel, having to respect your elders, having to respect your elderly boss who's a male, things like that. That plays a big factor into it, whether you're a survivor or not, just as a young person.
And I think something that everyone here can agree to, we can unite on, is that shame has absolutely no place in these conversations. Only empathy, understanding, and a commitment to doing better by our young people.
I think in terms of considering the cultural context of young people, and when I say culture, I don't mean our broader Australian culture, I mean our cultures as coloured people. And it's not applying a deficit model that is so often applied when working with our communities. It's actually about, again, like Harry captured it perfectly, speaking from a point of empathy and understanding, and like we were speaking about shame just before, and that shame is exacerbated and amplified when you're working with communities of colour who, particularly young people, it's not just shame about maybe their own personal lived experience, it's also factoring in the shame on the family and their broader cultural community and the consequences that they might experience if they then go on to disclose, if they then go on to challenge their parents who may be perpetrating or the elders who may be perpetrating. There's real consequences there for that young person's well-being, their mental health. It's a really complex environment for young people already, but there's that added layer of shame and thinking and reflecting of what's the potential consequences for me if I disclose or if I take that step forward and challenge potentially outdated ideas on gender and outdated ideas on sex and relationships. What's the consequences for me? And I think the young people who have done that in this space have been so brave and so careful and considerate in the way they do that. And they're leaving, a legacy for the next young people to do the same thing.
That was a really good point. And I just want to kind of follow on from that as well, is that I think that even in the conversations that I'm in, is that acknowledging where systematic and symbolic racism is actually showing up in our day-to-day lives and having the conversations with people who are they're not aware of their own biases. They're not aware of how they are being racist, or they're not actually considering the cultural impacts as well. And I think that it's really important, and I'm Caucasian, and I think that's really important that we are all having these conversations and that it's not just up to a person of color to be speaking about it. Actually, if it is a family member, if it is a friend that is making these comments, that is creating, again, more of this environment that just accepts these attitudes, I think it's all of our responsibility to actually hold them accountable and say, we're not going to be having these conversations. We don't talk about that. Like, we don't talk about things like that here. It's not happening. And I think that's also a big part of accountability and responsibility as well.
And just to build on that point as well, when we're, thinking about how young people navigate, particularly young people of colour, are navigating our DFE frontline services and our legal system, but also understanding the experiences that they're coming from with their parents. And like for myself, my parents are both migrants who didn't finish high school, so that immediately impacts, their numeracy and literacy. And I know a lot of young people in my community have very similar experiences when their parents are migrated. And you'll have young people who are at these services who might be translating in English. And sometimes it's translating their parents' trauma. And that's the first time a service has heard it. So the burden that rests on young people of colour who have lived experience, either from a family member experiencing or their experience themselves, it's a huge burden for them to carry, and I think is a big gap that we still need to consider and work to address.
I think you're completely right with that, and just about how diverse culture is, that leads us into making sure that our work is diverse as well. And, support systems and organisations can tailor specifically to people that require diverse care as well. Like, I come from a multicultural background. I'm both Torres Strait Islander and Indian. And so when DV plays the part that it does in my life, well, it's important that support systems are looking at various aspects of culture, including religion, including spirituality, including cultural norms, including traditional law. These things that are part of culture, they overlap and they also play a part in the trauma as well. And so that's how we can unpack different trauma, like physical or psychological or emotional. And so the way that a victim survivor will will experience what they do is so individualized that it almost feels impossible to talk about, because it's so like, it just feels like very specific to your own self. And it's like almost like, oh, I shouldn't get into this conversation because no one else has it like this. But in reality, like, there are words that are called like that, that's called that, or it is a thing, or there is a label. And like, I don't know, I just feel like culture plays such a big part in the way that trauma is like, and violence is received. And especially for diverse people, people of color, like, you have to go into so many more elements of culture to be able to figure out how this is personally impacting them. Yeah.
Thanks, Ria and Rachel. I think that's really important. And you both delivered it in such a really clear and impactful way. And I think, yes, absolutely so important for services to understand that. And I think the culture as young people as a whole, although we're not a homogenous group, there is a shared culture that, you know, the language that we share, the use of technology that we share. It's important for services to understand that, because that is, again, how you can get on their level and have that understanding to be able to go deeper in your conversations. And I think a really great way of doing that in your service is hiring young people.
I think as a survivor and someone who has faced immense mental health battles, you know, I have wanted to take my own life before, and I've navigated through that. I can tell you that the mental health system is often reactive rather than proactive, and I just don't understand why we wait for a young person or an individual in general to reach a crisis point before we get involved. I think there should be, from the outset, there should be a mindset of prevention and education, and fostering that openness to have these discussions and speak out about things, as we were touching on with the last prompt. So.
And I think I completely agree with what you're saying. And especially just, you know, I'm at the end of my psychology degree now. And even just looking at the process of getting a mental health care plan, even understanding the process of seeking support. So even in New South Wales, we have something called CAMS, which is a Children and Adolescent Mental Health Service, which is done by the New South Wales Department of Health. And that, even just understanding how young people get into that program is already, you have to jump through so many hoops. And exactly like what Harry just said, it's very reactive. It's like, well, everything that you're experiencing isn't really valid until something really bad happens. But if someone breaks their leg, it's kind of like, oh, we need to make sure that you get immediate care because you can see it. And it's really about ensuring that young people's mental health and their own well-being is validated and it's treated as such from a preventative perspective. So looking at how can we have those prevention initiatives to prevent it from happening, looking at the intervention, so ensuring that there are things in place, and then what other support services are there that are relevant for young people. And I think that Kids Helpline, I feel like, is something that I always think about, because they have different ways of young people being able to access their support, whether it's through a phone call, whether it's through a like a message or email. You can have access to a counsellor. And all the way up to your 25 years, they've got so much support there. And I think that it's really important that young people, they know where to go for help and ensuring that it's accessible as possible.
And trauma-informed care should not just be a specialised service either. It should be like the foundation of all mental health support. You know, a young person should not have to go to different providers every time and explain their trauma all over again, or just be made to feel like they're just a case to be managed. That's awful.
Yeah.
And it's just that clinical thing that we were speaking about before. And they deserve to be heard and seen as a whole person. And I think that's been a constant that we've touched on today.
And I as well that I know that there is a lot of social workers that do great work in this space, as well as other allied health professionals, but also understanding that there are so many social factors that go into a consultation, and that someone may be presenting with symptoms, they may be presenting with certain behaviors, but ensuring that you're seeing that individual or that young person as a whole person, and understanding that it's, oh, well, there isn't something wrong with you. And I think that's where a lot of that hesitation comes in, because it's like they actually were like, oh, hang on, I'm experiencing so much of these large social factors that have impacted my well-being, and now I'm being told that, like, you just want to put a label on it because there's something wrong with me now. And actually being able to ensure that young people are being seen and heard and validated with acknowledgement and validation of social factors that have influenced how they're feeling.
I think that's really important to reiterate to services that young people are not just an extension of their parent that's coming in to seek help. And Kids Helpline is a great example. And it's also like practitioners can sit with a young person and call Kids Helpline together, or they can navigate that website together. And maybe it is a little bit out of the objective of what maybe the consultation with mum was, but again, it is also recognizing that that young person is their own person. They are a victim in their own right if something has happened to mum while they're at home.
Absolutely. And even when I was doing my subject in forensic psychology, and there has been a traumatic event, or there is other different services being involved, something that we were taught is that sometimes you might be in a consult with a young person, but maybe you're just playing Mario Kart together, and actually developing that therapeutic alliance and developing that relationship, that it's not so much, all right, we need to sit down and we need to unpack everything right now. It's actually developing the relationship and valuing therapeutic alliance and building that relationship over time, so that if something does come out or they do feel like talking about it, that there's already that relationship there, and it's not having to jump from provider to provider because they feel like that's all been too much. It's about valuing the relationship.
And I think like a part of a healthy healing journey is getting your mental health checked out from the start, and being on that journey as much as it is confronting, and at times, it can be confronting for those aspects of what has been passed down to us that we, don't know where it came from, or what have we been exposed to, and this. But like, I just feel like, down the line, when you end up growing up and, moving out of that space of young people into being an adult, these coping mechanisms and what we teach ourselves is for, our children to come. It's for a better version of ourselves in the future that is more mental health aware. But, it's just, it's all about healing yourself, I just feel, and like your mental health and being mentally stable as well is such a big, important part of life, that I just think that like we should be teaching kids to put that at the front from the start, and not stigmatizing it, but just, from the start, it should be something that we're all working on individually and, as a whole.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, again, valuing that and really reinforcing and validating that your mental health and your well-being is important. It's just as important as your general health and well-being. And just because you can't see it doesn't mean that it's less important. And being able to equip young people, children from kindergarten, young people in high school, with that, like working on that capacity building, working on those skills for them to be able to not only validate and identify their emotions, but knowing what their support system looks like and knowing where they can seek help as well.
Also, another massive thing is accessibility when it comes to mental health support as well. Services are almost always underfunded. They're stretched thin. Their wait lists are long. Young people might live in a regional area where they live far away from mental health services. There might be a lack of culturally diverse ways of providing mental health support. And I think we really need to change how we deliver mental health support, like bringing it into schools, bringing it into communities, bringing it into using technology to create innovative ways to really push mental health support.
Yeah, I think oftentimes, like in society, we put the biomedical health model like at the top. So, as you were saying, we don't always value someone else's like mental health. Like if they have a broken leg, we put that above someone who's experiencing severe depression. And you can see that like even the way that people talk about mental health, there is still so much shame, there is still so much stigma, and that's slowly changing. But I think the question is, how can we fast track that? How can we create more awareness in communities, I should say?
That was a really great point as well, with having that stigma and that's already there, that reaching out for support, and then circling back to what Harry said, the accessibility coming from a regional city. The wait lists are ridiculous there, and as they are in most cities, there's often no access to mental health support. So what happens in that meantime, in that wait? I know at Headspace, it's 10 to 12 months back at home before you can get in for any form of support. And then for the younger children, the only program we've got now currently is on pause for intake. There's another service that you can only access if you're involved with child safety, and that's pretty much it. And so with having no accessibility to these support services, what can other services do to better equip themselves for these particular scenarios with children needing support? And it's like I've brought up at work in past is that, the ratio of workers that will help children versus what we've got for the women. So we only have 2 in the service that I'm in for the children, and we always are going to have more children than we are women, because women come in with multiple children. So is it a question of potentially equipping workers with the ability to assist children in any sort of workplace, I suppose, like schools, as well, better equipping teachers to be able to support these children and young people better while they're waiting for the actual help. And then also, if they are in a crisis because they haven't been able to access this help and they go to the hospital, how often young people and people in general are being turned away from mental health supports. In Townsville, we have the mental health care team, but if you're having a mental health crisis on Friday, Saturday or Sunday, don't go up there. There's no mental health care team up there over those days. So there is a really big gap, and I suppose that's the reason that they have to be reactive instead of proactive, because there's not enough capacity or funding to be able to be proactive in this space. And I think that's a really big thing, that the government need to be funding these frontline services way better, because at the end of the day, the workers that are there, it's an underfunded service, they're overworked, and then you're going to be losing the people with the heart because they're burnt out and they're not able to access any mental health supports either. So this is we're going in a cycle, and it's needs funding really to improve this space for young people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in terms of, advocating to government to fund these frontline services who are so desperate to improve their capacity, at a more broader sense, it's also understanding, like we tend to really silo these problems off, like mental health is over here, DV is over here, gender-based violence is over here, housing is over here. But this is a really intricate system where these social problems actually feed into each other. And the Man Box study that was released recently shows, young men and boys in Australia who really endorse harmful attitudes around women and gender and sex are more likely to have worse mental health outcomes. So understanding the linkages there between having harmful attitudes and beliefs which we know drive violence, but also it's driving poorer outcomes for our men and boys. And that's a whole other conversation we need to unpack. If we're going to address gender-based violence in its entirety, it's working in a multi-pronged approach, whilst also understanding at its core, we need to really unpack not just gender equality, yes, that's absolutely critical, but also all these other issues that are feeding into this problem.
It's got the worst Venn diagram ever.
Yeah, but I think you have nailed that perfectly,
Yeah,
because I think it's actually understanding, instead of reflecting mental health in a biomedical model, actually using a socio-ecological model and actually looking at all of how so many different social factors, all the way from an individual to the social relationships to what's happening in organizations, and then also systematic policy side, and then you got social structures on top, and how all of that connects into everything else. So we want to talk about, housing, looking at how women are even, how this whole thing has been, women escaping domestic violence. Why are women having to be the ones that have to leave their home? Why are they the ones that have to leave? Then you've got funding cuts that is occurring when it comes to, shelters, and then it keeps going on. But then, housing the housing policy is completely put in a different bucket, when actually it is so connected to everything else. Housing is a fundamental human need. If you don't have a roof over your head, then what? And I feel like what needs to occur moving forward is that when we are looking at policies, from mental health care plans to funding domestic violence, gender-based violence, frontline services, to looking at even accessible housing, I think that when we're looking at these policy changes and where funding is allocated in the federal budget, that the ones that are making the decisions need to understand that they are all connected with each other, and how we need to think about the individuals that are not at the table. And that's, again, why we need to make sure that young people and the individuals that are experiencing these challenges, that they are involved in the conversation, because at the moment, we have the problem, but nothing's being done, because we're in the same exact position as we were when we're thinking about housing and all these funds not being there for mental health and these wait lists. We're still here. We're aware of the problem, but now what?
Yeah. And I think like what everyone's points have made and sort of factored into, that has been perfectly summed up by Maddie and Rachel, is that we're not here to simply talk about how we improve the systems. We have to fundamentally change how we understand and how we offer that support of mental health to our children and young people, everyone in general. And I think that change starts with all of us.
What I've learned overall is, in order to make it effective, it's actually inviting them into the room and developing something with them, and really thinking about the keyword of collaboration.
Through my work, what I've really learnt and taken away from, in terms of centering young people's voices, is what the beauty of bringing them along for the journey, and that goes far beyond just bringing young people along to a consultation or a youth advisory group. It's actually bringing young people along and having them at the core of program delivery and design. And there's plenty of examples here in Queensland, but also across Australia, where when young people are given that autonomy and that agency, that they can drive really impactful change at the community level.
I've learned a lot so far. I think it's been a long learning journey, but I think it's just that we have to continuously be reflective in our own sense, individually, and collectively as a whole group, as young people, we have to continue to be reflective. So my biggest skill is being able to engage in critical reflection. I think within this space, it's important that other young people are coming on this journey while being pushed to be uncomfortable, and also being surrounded by support when that uncomfortability gets too much.
I've learnt that it is innately critical to make sure that youth are speaking about the issues that they face, and because if the youth aren't speaking about it and you're not speaking to youth about what's going on, how are you meant to know? That's just assumptions, and then you're basing all the work that you're doing off assumptions. And I think it's important to really value what youth have to say, because they have such unique expertise on their situations, and we really need to grab hold of that and use it to better advantage the children who are facing so many systemic barriers.
I think particularly in this sector, it can be hard for services and organisations to look to young people and to consult with them when they're most worried about making sure that their mum is safe or their guardian is safe. So I think it's really important to be able to acknowledge and recognise that although a young person may not be experiencing physical violence, if they are a witness to it, they are a victim in their own right. And it's important to ensure that whoever is walking into your service gets treated with care and respect and gets the help that they deserve.
I've learnt that from young people, there's so much knowledge that they have that's not always valued. And we always seem to put a lot of emphasis on knowledge that is written by academics, but there is a lot of lived experience from young people.
Well, centering the voices of children and young people is critical. I know it firsthand as a young person myself. You know, I've had to knock on 50 doors just to knock on the 51st in order to be heard and have my opinions and ideas taken seriously. So I understand the difficulty that young people are faced with in today's climate. Children are not just the future, they are the present, and they have as much of a right as adults do to express their opinions in policies and practices that affect them. So it's incredibly important, and it's something that I advocate for, it's something that I push for. And I think I'm doing that through practice with the campaigning, and I'm showing other young people, or I hope that I'm showing other young people, that they have the ability and the power to do that as well.
I hope that the people that are listening really think and they take away that when young people are experiencing a situation, a challenge, that all their feelings are valid and that they're in such a different climate to what they may have grown up in, and meeting them with empathy and kindness and compassion and thinking how you can support them and be next to them instead of speaking down to them or viewing them as, oh, you're just a child, you don't know what you're talking about. Actually validating their experience, and always as well, instead of meeting them with judgment, meet them with curiosity.
The one thing that I want people listening in to take away is to bring young people on board and employ them in our organisations and in our workplaces. They can really enrich in program delivery and design when they're given the opportunity to.
I hope that people can maybe expand their minds and open up their minds a little bit to how different other people live, like just in general, how different we all are. It just pushes us to be a bit more open-minded and reflective and, allow for challenges to come that won't necessarily act as barriers in our life, but just as something to help build resilience.
Listen to the youth, and don't just listen, act on what they're asking you to do. And when you go forth in acting, let them see that you've heard them, you're acting on it, and then so they can see an outcome, because if youth have to keep talking and they don't see any change, they're not going to want to keep talking to you.
One thing I want people to take away from today is that young people's voices are important, whether they have individually experienced physical or sexual violence or not. If they have witnessed it in the home, they are victims in their own right and should be treated as such.
There is always more to learn, and there's always more room for growth in their work and in their personal lives too.
It is simply not enough to just listen to these stories. We must have the courage to act on them.